Welcome to the Morning Assembly. I am Sutreja, your host for today's assembly. Let's start with the morning prayers.
Srinath ji, 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 Srinath ji.
मने प्यारू लागे हो, मने प्यारू लागे श्री जी तारू नाम।
धन 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 श्री जी ना चरणों मां, धन 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 श्री जी ना चरणों मां।
ओ मैं तो छोड़ी दी था हो, मैं तो छोड़ी दी था सगड़ा का।
धन 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 श्री जी ना चरणों मां, धन 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 श्री जी ना चरणों मां। श्रीनाथ जी, 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 श्रीनाथ जी।
Today's assembly is based on the theme of democracy. Chahna will start by explaining the different types of governments.
There are 5 different types of governments. One of them is monarchy, where there is only one ruler, traditionally a king or an emperor. In modern times, monarchy is described as dictatorship. The second type of government is oligarchy, where there are a few rulers, traditionally a small group of people who rule the country together. The third type of government is theocracy, technically the rule of God. Since the God does not appear every day to manage day-to-day affairs of the government, instead, the ruler of the country is a religious leader or a group of religious officials who interpret the God's will. The fourth type of government is authoritarianism, the principle of blind submission to authority, where there is no freedom of individual thoughts and actions. It concentrates the power in the hands of the leader or a small group of elites. The fifth type of government is totalitarianism, ruled by an elite that exercises unlimited power over individuals in all aspects of life.
Now Shivani will tell us what is democracy.
Namaste. What is democracy? Democracy is a form of government in which people have the authority to choose their own governing legislators. The term is derived from the Greek word demokratia, which was coined from demos, people, and kratos, rule, in the middle of the 5th century to denote the political systems then existing in some Greek city-states, notably Athens. Thank you.
Next, we have Ansh and Devangi who will describe the characteristics of democracy.
Sovereignty with people. In democracy, the supreme power is in the hands of people, and people use their power through their representatives who are elected by them. In short, we can say the ultimate source of state power are the people. Respect for opinion of minority. In a democratic setup, majority rules, but opinions of minorities are also given respect. They are encouraged to give their opinion. Democracy, being a government by free discussion and criticism, encourages both the positive and negative aspects of any proposal. The majority must tolerate the opinion of the minority, otherwise the democracy will degenerate into authoritarianism. Liberty is very necessary for the overall growth of man. In democracy, everybody has the right to express his her thoughts and emotions, the right to form associations, right to criticize, the right to criticize the government, and the right to hold any occupation. State provides proper facilities to protect these types of rights. Political equality. The democracy is based on political equality. It means all citizens, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, race, or sex, are considered to be equal before the law and enjoy equal political rights. Political equality gives the right to vote to every citizen.
Rule by consent. Democracy means consent and not on force. The consent of the majority of the people is collected by dialogues, discussions, and debates, and a solution is given. Implies open society. Democracy itself implies open and free society, that is, the majority of the people decide the actions of the government. Different unions and organizations have been formed to discuss these problems openly and to come up with a solution. Rule of majority. Democracy itself means rule of majority. That is, after a fixed interval of time, elections are held and the party with the majority of the vote is elected and rules for a fixed time. Independent and impartial judiciary. This is the most important element of democracy. Independent judiciary means to protect the rule of the law and giving correct judgment to the people. Democracy is characterized by independent judiciary. The judiciary is independent of the executive and legislature, and no government organ influences the judiciary.
Arhaan and Yug will now outline the disadvantages of democracy.
So now I'm going to be talking about the disadvantages of democracy. It's common nowadays to see society divided into segments, each with a different perspective about the policies undertaken by their governments. It is something which keeps the true essence of democracy alive. Here are the various democratic deficits that are thought to exist within a country. Firstly, there is short-termism. Democracy is criticized for not offering enough political stability. As governments are frequently selected on and off, there tend to be frequent changes in the policies of democratic countries. Democratic institutions work on consensus to decide an issue, which usually takes longer than a unilateral decision. Processes slow down to the point where it can take several years to create significant changes. Secondly, there is corruption. According to global trends in corruption, it can be concluded that democracy does not effectively deal with corruption. One important aspect of democracy is the electoral process, which can be considered easily corruptible. Democracy is not immune from external problems. For example, the giving and receiving of bribes and threats to use violence very often corrupt the electoral process.
Democracy is ineffective unless voters educate themselves on governing decisions. President Teddy reportedly once said this: "A vote is like a rifle. Its usefulness depends upon the character of the user." People have the mentality that the chances that one's vote would be the deciding factor in election is minuscule. Therefore, why would one take the time to inform themselves with very little reward? The cause of voter ignorance is not due to a lack of intelligence, but they are rather simply rationally ignorant, which is a major problem in democracies. Democracy systematically ignores the interest of future people. The citizens of tomorrow are granted no rights, nor there are any bodies to represent their concerns or political views on decisions today that will undoubtedly affect their lives. This is the primary reason why thousands of children worldwide are inspired by Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, have been striking to get rich nations to reduce their carbon emissions. They have had enough of democratic systems that push their futures out of the political.
We now have Anya who will speak a few words regarding democracy gone wrong.
Our political systems have become the cause of short-term terrorism. Politicians can barely see beyond the next election. Governments prefer quick fixes, such as putting more criminals behind bars, rather than focusing on the deeper social and economic causes of crime. Nations bicker around international conference tables focused on the near term interests rather than focusing on our planet that is currently burning and the species that are disappearing. The number of examples is overwhelming. From Russia to Venezuela to Thailand to the Philippines, countries that once appeared to be developing into democracies today seem to be headed in a different direction. In 2005, for the first time in history, more than half the world's people were living under democratic systems. Then, trends started to reverse when the leaders who had emerged morphed into elected autocrats once they got into office. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez is now essentially an elected dictator. In Kyrgyzstan, the leader who led the 2005 Tulip Revolution soon proved himself to be just as authoritarian as the predecessor. And in Russia, Putin used the power he won in elections to dismantle the country's democracy.
Now Daksh will speak about democracy in context to India.
Taking into consideration the latest trends, it seems like India might be the next in this list. The challenges for India's democracy have been numerous and often of extraordinary magnitude, yet India has so far defied the predictions about the end of its democracy. The country has managed to muddle through without becoming some kind of hybrid state or simply an authoritarian one. However, the recent democracy report by the VDEM Institute puts India in the league of countries like Brazil, Poland, the US, and Hungary who have significant slides into authoritarianism. It is believed that India has continued on a path of steep decline, to the extent that it has almost lost its status as a democracy. India is in danger of losing its position as a democratic country. Once a party has won an election, it is unaccountable for its acts. Parliament barely functions. Large sections of the media are scared. The judiciary is overburdened and dysfunctional. The civil service and the police are in the pocket of the government. Independent news websites and television channels have faced intimidation through attacks. Despite this Indian democracy in decline and not collapse, we need to reinvent democracy for the long term.
Aleen will be now presenting a spoken word poetry on democracy.
Democracy is a process that you see: transparency, accountability, advocacy, legitimacy, elections free and fair, to cast a ballot, to care about the issues that move you.
Let me give you a few: education, security, inclusion, jobs without
confusion. Each person is equal under the law. People with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, those are at margin, historically, physically, ethnically, and politically marginalized. Meet with the decision makers, not the takers. Human rights put down grassroots. They organize, growing and flourishing. They nourish and humanize our hopes and dreams. As a community, and democracy without institutions, improbable. Without women and youth diversity, impossible. In the absence and breakdown of these pillars, a breach happens between governments and people. A democracy, while so good, can be dark. With unions so fragile, it might break your heart to see poverty, disease, refugees, natural disasters, climate change, insecurities, war and ethnic conflicts, terrorism and violent extremism.
There are 1.5 billion people who live in conflict-inflicted
areas, where children are hungry, men are hungry, women are hungry. Not just hungry for food, hungry for economic and political opportunities. Because of the deficits in government accountability, propelling the risks of instability and violence, like the cost of war in Yemen, Iraq and Syria, and citizens organizing for change in Ukraine and Tunisia. Meanwhile, disinformation wreaks havoc on the unknowing. Glowing in our faces from our screens, relaying news as something that more than it would ever be seen. No, it is under the scenes. This is why a democracy must deliver. And not just a ballot every few years, it is every single day. You have the freedom to speak your mind. Vote your way without fear. Democracy connects communities and nations. It is not an export or an imposition, rather response to hopes and aspirations. Supporting universal care.
Because what happens in Moscow doesn't stay there.
Compromise and tolerance play important roles. Your soul, interest doesn't drive you. You must meet in the middle, and by showing more than a little respect, talk to your enemy. Build a better life together. And remember, no dictator, strongman or kingsmaker can match the power of your vote. Your rights,
your freedom, the power of you.
Lastly, we have Dev Sachde, who will recite a Hindi poem on democracy by Tapsi Pannu.
रखी है हमने नए भारत की बुनियाद, होंगे सफल अगर हो संवाद। विज्ञान की खोज में निकले थे हम, अंधविश्वासों में डूबे इसका है गम। न्यू इंडिया में होगा ना कोई बेरोजगार, फिर चुनाव जाते ही क्यों बदले सब यार। संविधान कहे कि हम सब एक है, फिर धर्म जात में क्यों बटे हैं। भूखा ना सोएगा कोई, सबका होगा घर। नेक है ख्याल अगर मिटे मन का डर। जनतंत्र में सवाल जब भी उठाए, राष्ट्र विरोधी वो क्यों कहलाए। वसुदेव कुटुंब ये दुनिया को सिखलाया, फिर हम ही ने ये क्यों न निभाया। हम है देश मर्यादा पुरुषोत्तम, क्यों तोड़ देते हैं ये वादा हम। चलो नए भारत को बनाए महान, ना डर ना जुमले, बस इंसानियत की पहचान। रखे हम एक ऐसे भारत की बुनियाद, हो सफल कर सबसे संवाद। धन्यवाद।
The word democracy comes from the Greek words of demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power or rule. So, democracy basically means the rule of the people. Democracy first started as a direct democracy in Greek cities, notably ancient Athens, where people came together to speak about their concerns and opinions in front of rulers of the city-state, and directly voted on new rules and laws. Here is considered as the birthplace of democracy. For the very first time, decisions were made by the people instead of rulers. But sadly, the ancient Greeks did not see all people equally. Slaves, women, children, and the people who did not have a land weren't allowed to vote. This is what we call a flawed democracy today. After the Greeks lost their power and influence in the 1st century AD, their early forms of democracy were also fading away until the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. Which prevented the King of England to do whatever he wanted and said that even the king had to follow the country's rules and laws which were written in the Constitution. Today, most democracies are indirect or representative, which means that you can't vote for a new law yourself, but you can vote for people who then become lawmakers and present your interests. But democracy isn't just about voting. It's about everything to protect the best interests of the people, no matter what is their race, gender, political opinion, or religion. These interests can be human rights, quality of life, infrastructure, and many more. Modern democracies divide power into 3 different branches: the legislative, the people who make the law; the executive, the people who make sure that you obey the law; and the judiciary, who judge you if you commit a crime. These 3 are independent and work following the process, checks and balances, which means all the work must be clear and fair. And very important, the people who have power also must follow the law and not exceed their authority. In addition, a democratic government must work in a way that reflects the wish, feeling, desire, and values of the society that it governs. This is also known as the general will, which is a concept developed by the famous Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. One of the problems of democratic voting is that the biggest groups of people always have the most power, and that's why a good democracy also has laws to protect the rights of its smaller and weaker groups. A democracy where the majority chooses to separate, expel, or injure its minority is not a functioning democracy. So, what do you think now about democracy? Winston Churchill once said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Do you agree?